Naomi Rivera decided to treat herself after completing an especially taxing work project. She closed her laptop that morning with a deep exhale, satisfied that the long hours of research and writing were finally behind her. While some people might celebrate a milestone with a fancy dinner or a weekend trip, Naomi wanted nothing more than a relaxed afternoon at her apartment complex's pool, a quiet escape from her usual routine. She packed a lightweight tote with a paperback novel, a fluffy beach towel, and a chilled water bottle, then stepped into the warm sunshine of Lakecrest Apartments. The pool area, set in a cozy corner of the property and partially shaded by tall palm trees, seemed perfect for unwinding. Naomi arrived to find only a handful of residents scattered about, a young couple sunbathing quietly and an older gentleman flipping through a newspaper in the far corner. Music from a distant radio drifted through the air, not loud enough to disturb anyone's peace. With a sigh of contentment, Naomi draped her towel over a lounge chair, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to dissolve. She took a moment to admire the surroundings. Lakecrest Apartments was a well-kept complex with lush landscaping and neat brick paths. The on-site HOA, though sometimes strict on matters like balcony decorations or allowed pet breeds, ensured the common areas were comfortable and orderly. In Naomi's experience, that arrangement usually meant more pros than cons. The ground stayed clean, and the pool was rarely crowded. Settling into her seat, Naomi flipped open her novel, an engaging mystery she'd been saving for just such a leisurely day. The distant hum of traffic beyond the apartment gates and the soft conversations of the other swimmers provided a subtle backdrop. She found herself half tempted to doze off, but the intrigue of the story kept her turning pages. Time blurred in the gentle haze of chlorinated water and lazy sunshine. The final vestiges of stress melted away, replaced by a contented sense of accomplishment. Naomi's phone chimed occasionally with notifications, but she resisted the pull to glance at work emails or social media. She deserved an afternoon free of obligations, and the crystalline shimmer of the pool affirmed her decision. This was exactly the restorative break she needed. In that tranquil setting, Naomi had no inkling that her peace would soon be disrupted. Thoughts of conflict or confrontation never crossed her mind. Why would they? The pool was a communal amenity, open to all residents, and she'd done nothing out of the ordinary, just reading, relaxing, and perhaps occasionally dipping a toe in the water to cool off. But the day, which started so blissfully, was about to veer into the unexpected. The seeds of tension had already been planted, in the form of a resident known for stirring trouble whenever her standards went unmet. And though Naomi remained unaware of it now, she would soon find herself at the heart of a bizarre confrontation that would test both her patience and her sense of justice. For a few blissful minutes, Naomi Rivera thought she might have the pool at Lakecrest Apartments mostly to herself. She'd propped open her paperback, allowing the warm sun to lull her into a comfortable haze of post-project relaxation. Yet, just as she began to unwind, a sudden shuffle of sandals alerted her to a new arrival. Out of the corner of her eye, Naomi observed a woman, Karen, as neighbors referred to her, stepping into the gated pool area. Karen wore a bright pink swimsuit with flashy, expensive-looking sunglasses perched atop meticulously coiffed hair. Everything about her demeanor suggested she believed the world revolved around her, from the confident strut of her steps to the way she surveyed the pool as though it were her personal kingdom. Naomi glanced away, hoping to avoid any confrontation. Her previous run-ins with Karen had been minor but memorable enough to make Naomi wary. She recalled hearing that Karen held some self-appointed position within the HOA, which seemed to amplify her sense of authority. Unfortunately, Karen took up a lounge chair uncomfortably close to Naomi, despite there being plenty of space around the pool. Naomi sensed the tension even before Karen spoke. The woman's gaze flickered from Naomi's novel to the small pile of personal belongings by her chair, eventually settling on Naomi's face. Then, in a clipped tone, Karen asked, "Do you actually live here?" Naomi, slightly taken aback, nodded politely. "Yes, I've been a resident for 2 years," she responded. The way Karen's expression shifted, mingling disbelief with a hint of disapproval, told Naomi everything she needed to know. Underlying the question was more than a casual inquiry. it felt like an insinuation that Naomi somehow didn't fit the image of a typical occupant in the complex. Refusing to let her mood be ruined, Naomi calmly reiterated she was indeed a leaseholder at Lakecrest Apartments. Karen's eyebrows rose, and she muttered something about needing to check that, as if verifying property rosters was part of her personal duties. Naomi tried returning to her book, determined not to let an interloper hijack her quiet afternoon. But she couldn't shake the uneasy sense that Karen's sudden presence signaled more than a casual neighborly chat. A handful of people splashing in the pool or sunbathing further away seemed unaware of the tension. Still, Naomi felt Karen's continued scrutiny, as though measuring every aspect of her presence, from the brand of her tote bag to the color of her towel. The entire scene struck Naomi as patently absurd. All she wanted was an hour or two of undisturbed rest, something any legitimate resident should be free to enjoy. Yet, if Karen's track record held true, an ordinary request might soon balloon into a confrontation, leaving Naomi torn between ignoring the provocations or standing her ground. With the notion that the day's peace hung by a thread, Naomi steeled herself, bracing for whatever might come next, even as she turned a page in her novel and attempted to recapture the serenity she'd arrived to find. No more than 10 minutes had passed before Aisha Sterling realized she wouldn't be left in peace by the pool at Havenwood Residences. She'd settled in with a detective novel, hoping to pass a lazy hour under the sun. Then she felt a sudden presence, a woman dropping onto the adjacent lounge chair with an air of entitlement. It was Karen, the same figure known for her unstoppable commentary on every trivial violation in the community. Aisha tried to continue reading, but she couldn't ignore the pointed questions Karen lobbed her way. "You sure you live here?" Karen repeated, this time with a faint trace of suspicion in her voice. Aisha, forcing a measured smile, informed her she'd been a tenant for nearly 2 years. That detail seemed to agitate Karen further, as though the concept of Aisha being a long-term resident clashed with the assumption that she was somehow out of place. Infusing the exchange was an undercurrent of something heavier, a note of prejudice. The way Karen pronounced certain words, the disapproving glint in her eyes, they hinted at a deeper bias that made Aisha's presence objectionable in Karen's mind. It wasn't the first time Aisha had encountered this kind of attitude, but it still stung, an unwelcome intrusion into what should have been a tranquil afternoon. Karen's conversation turned abruptly personal, insinuating that certain people lowered property values or disturbed the community's aesthetic. Aisha, her patience waning, stayed composed. She reminded Karen that Havenwood was a diverse complex, one that welcomed a broad range of residents, a fact endorsed by the HOA guidelines themselves. The mention of the HOA seemed to spur Karen on, as though she thought the bylaws only validated her stance. Their brief back-and-forth culminated in a tense silence, with both women occupying lounge chairs that felt uncomfortably close. A small crowd of swimmers, oblivious to the quiet confrontation, splashed around. But Aisha sensed an unspoken challenge radiating from Karen, a dare to push back or prove her right to lounge by this communal amenity. Inwardly, Aisha debated whether to escalate matters, should she contact management, or wait to see if Karen would simply relent and move on. The notion of confrontation didn't appeal to her. She'd come to the pool to escape the daily grind, not to spar with a self-appointed guardian of neighborhood purity. Yet, she suspected Karen wouldn't vanish on her own. The woman's unwavering stare, the subtle barbs delivered under her breath, all indicated she was sizing up Aisha, perhaps ready to ignite a scene. Aisha took a mental breath, reminding herself that dignity and calm were her best shields. She resolved to maintain her composure, come what may. After all, if Karen's next step was to call for some authority or spin a new narrative, Aisha had the truth on her side. She was a legitimate occupant, quietly reading a book by the pool, guilty of nothing more than wanting a peaceful break. A warm breeze skimmed the surface of the community pool, rustling a few stray leaves that had landed on the turquoise water. Mina Castillo, stretched out on a lounge chair with a beach towel and a bottle of iced tea at her side, was savoring a moment of calm. The hum of distant traffic and the subdued chatter of other residents provided a gentle backdrop for her to read or simply daydream. Yet that tranquility was shattered when Karen, known for policing every perceived offense within the HOA, marched into view. Karen's demeanor radiated restless energy as she approached with purposeful strides. Her eyes locked onto Mina, almost immediately ignoring the other swimmers. In a pointed tone, Karen demanded to see proof that Mina actually belonged there, as though an ID or a letter from management were required to occupy a recliner near the deep end. Mina found herself momentarily speechless. She'd never encountered such a direct challenge in a shared residential space, especially from a neighbor she'd never even formally met. "I've lived here for over a year," Mina managed, keeping her voice even. She offered a polite smile, hoping to diffuse the tension. But her calm only seemed to irk Karen, who insisted that a community like Suncrest Gardens can't just have random individuals wandering around. The insinuation was clear. Karen perceived her as an outsider, perhaps undeserving of such a leisurely setting. Mina took a moment to reflect on the absurdity of the situation. A communal pool was precisely that, communal. She had every right to be there, and no occupant was required to carry around documentation to sunbathe or read in the designated lounge area. The vibe quickly shifted from mild annoyance to a heavier sense of foreboding when Karen reached for her phone, punching in digits with an air of defiance. At first, Mina assumed Karen might call the HOA to rant about an imaginary violation, but the conversation that followed suggested otherwise. Karen had dialed 911. Within earshot of other neighbors, Karen loudly explained she felt threatened by an unfamiliar person acting suspiciously. She pointedly claimed that Mina was loitering and refusing to leave. The few onlookers who caught wind of Karen's statements appeared puzzled. Mina, nearly paralyzed by disbelief, stared in astonishment at how rapidly this mild disagreement had escalated. As Karen rattled off her address, presumably drawing first responders, Mina stepped forward to offer a rebuttal, only to realize it was pointless. The phone call was already in motion. In that moment, a swirl of thoughts flooded Mina's mind. Should she gather her belongings and walk away, avoiding a messy conflict? Or remain steadfast in the knowledge that she was entirely within her rights? She chose the latter, placing her trust in the notion that common sense and truth would prevail once the situation was examined. But a flicker of worry seeped in. How many times had she heard stories where an innocent person was mislabeled as a threat, only to face unwarranted legal consequences? All the while, Karen carried on her conversation with the dispatcher, painting Mina as an aggressive trespasser, sprinkling in details that made her sound menacing. Her face betrayed a twisted satisfaction, as if she relished the chance to direct official attention onto someone else. "She won't leave," Karen asserted. "I feel unsafe, she's definitely not from here." The sensational claim sent a chill down Mina's spine. Other residents, noticing the escalating drama, began gathering near the pool's edge. Some watched with concern, others whispered among themselves. A few seemed ready to intervene but hesitated, unsure how to defuse a confrontation that had risen so swiftly. Meanwhile, Mina drew a steady breath, recalling advice from loved ones about staying calm in such crises. She pulled out her phone as well, quietly opening the camera app to film or record audio if needed. If an officer arrived and the matter boiled down to one person's word against the other, any objective evidence might prove invaluable. Karen eventually ended her call with a flourish, letting out a triumphant sigh as she pocketed her phone. She turned back to Mina, her gaze sharp with challenge. "The police are on their way," she announced. "Maybe next time, you'll think twice before trespassing in someone else's yard." The reference to her yard perplexed Mina, given that the pool was, by definition, a shared amenity of Suncrest Gardens. The entire confrontation felt upside down, as if reason had no place in Karen's worldview. The hush that followed felt thick with anticipation. Some neighbors retreated to safe distances, not wanting to be caught in the middle if things got heated. In the distance, Mina could hear faint sirens, an unnerving sign that the authorities were indeed en route. Despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach, she squared her shoulders and readied herself for a civil, factual explanation of events. If Karen believed her intimidation and false claims would force a quick capitulation, she was mistaken. Mina refused to be bullied into relinquishing her rightful place at the pool. As she waited for the sirens to draw closer, she reminded herself that truth and composure often outshone fearmongering. She only hoped that, in this instance, reason would prevail over the frenetic theatrics Karen seemed bent on staging. Everything changed the moment Karen tried to seize control, this time through physical force. Amina Javed, who had decided to remain at the communal pool in Brookstone Villas, was in no mood to surrender her rightful space. She'd already endured Karen's pointed questions and the 911 call labeling her as suspicious. Yet as the sirens began echoing in the distance, signifying approaching officers, it became evident that Karen wasn't content merely to wait for them to arrive. A tense hush had settled over the other residents, many of whom watched from safe vantage points. The airy hum of cicadas layered over the muffled ripple of water. Amina stood near her lounge chair, aware that fleeing would look like admission of guilt. So she readied for a conversation with the police, mentally rehearsing how she'd calmly present her side. In her mind, the worst-case scenario was more verbal harassment or a standoff. Then Karen lunged. The suddenness of it almost stole Amina's breath. One moment, Karen was pacing near the pool's edge, phone in hand, presumably awaiting law enforcement. The next, she charged forward, arms outstretched, as though planning to shove or tackle Amina. Instinct, sharpened by years of martial arts classes, kicked in. Without fully conscious thought, Amina pivoted sideways, letting Karen's momentum carry her forward. She used the aggressor's force against her, hooking an arm around Karen's elbow and guiding her downward in a controlled takedown. It all happened within seconds, a flurry of movement that must have seemed choreographed to bystanders. In truth, it was second nature for someone who'd studied self-defense. Amina didn't slam Karen to the ground. Instead, she eased her down, ensuring no major injury. Her goal was to contain the threat, not cause harm. The crowd, rattled by the abrupt escalation, exhaled a collective gasp. Some reached for phones, presumably filming or preparing to call 911 again. On the cool concrete, Karen let out a piercing shriek, thrashing in Amina's arms. "Help! Assault! She's attacking me," she cried, her volume cranked to the maximum. In that instant, the delicate line between self-defense and potential allegations blurred. Amina froze for a split second, stunned that Karen's spin on events had begun literally the moment she was gently pinned. Sensing the precariousness of the scene, Amina released Karen carefully, stepping back to show she wasn't continuing any aggression. Yet Karen latched onto the scenario, hugging her elbow as though seriously hurt. She howled about her rights, leveling further accusations that Amina was trespassing, that Amina had physically thrown her to the ground, and that she, Karen, was the true victim. Meanwhile, watchers along the pool's perimeter stared in disbelief. A few who had glimpsed the actual scuffle recognized the contrived nature of Karen's claims. The wail of sirens grew louder, nearing the parking lot. Amina, determined to remain calm, raised her hands in a gesture of non-threatening compliance. She took in a slow breath, bracing for the police to see a scene that, at first glance, might appear chaotic: Karen on the ground, shrieking about assault, Amina standing above her, and an unsettled crowd. The knowledge that some had presumably recorded the moment gave Amina a faint hope that digital proof would clarify who was truly the aggressor. It was then that Karen's meltdown reached a new pitch. She hammered the pavement with her free hand, insisting Amina had attacked her for no reason, weaving a narrative that the martial arts takedown was entirely unprovoked. "She just launched herself at me," Karen rasped, tears in her eyes. "I was only trying to make her leave the pool." Amina, heart pounding, recognized how precarious the situation looked if an officer arrived without full context. But she also believed in the clarity that bystanders could offer. Several neighbors, outraged by Karen's blatant misrepresentation, stepped forward, tentatively, at first, but then with more confidence. They started voicing what they had witnessed: that Karen had been the first to lunge, that Amina's response was purely defensive, that no direct aggression had come from Amina before that moment. Still, the tension in the air felt electric, as if a single spark might reignite the confrontation. Amina worried that Karen could lash out again or that some bystanders, overshadowed by the spectacle, might feed into her false narrative. She had no illusions about how quickly misinformation could spread. The best she could do was stand her ground and trust the truth would come to light once law enforcement arrived. And arrive they did. The officers strode into the pool area, eyes sweeping over the scene, Karen still sprawled in a theatrical pose, Amina standing back with both hands raised slightly. Without prompting, onlookers chimed in, describing how Karen had attacked first. The officers, well practiced in discerning genuine victims from self-proclaimed ones, appeared cautious but receptive. They asked Amina to recount her side while listening to Karen's sobbing accusations. The mention of video recordings from residents provided a lifeline, visual evidence that might cut through the swirl of conflicting claims. In that moment, Amina realized that her earlier choice, to remain rather than flee, had been the right one. Her presence, combined with multiple eyewitness accounts, made it less likely Karen could twist the story unchallenged. The immediate threat of further violence had passed, yet the emotional turmoil lingered. With the pool area half frozen in shock, the stage was set for the authorities to sift through the chaos, determining who had indeed started the altercation, and who had simply acted in self-defense. A hush had settled over the poolside at Crestwood Terraces, abruptly punctuated by Karen's piercing cries for help. She lay on the damp concrete, feigning the posture of a victim who had been violently tackled. Talia Greer, still reeling from the adrenaline of having neutralized Karen's unexpected lunge, stood a few feet away, arms raised to convey that she posed no threat. The entire scene felt surreal. Talia in her simple swimwear, quietly reading minutes earlier, now at the center of a swirling drama fueled by Karen's accusations. "I've been assaulted," Karen shouted, tears or sweat gleaming on her face, it was hard to discern under the pool's glare. Her voice bounced off the tiled surfaces and reverberated across the water. A couple of onlookers, residents uncertain whether to comfort her or keep their distance, lingered near enough to watch, phone cameras discreetly at the ready. Talia's heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain composed. Every second that Karen spun her version of events threatened to overshadow the reality, that Talia had only acted to defend herself from Karen's sudden aggression. Over the hush of background chatter, Talia heard the distant wail of police sirens, presumably responding to Karen's earlier call. She recognized that if the authorities arrived to see Karen sprawled on the ground, proclaiming innocence, they might leap to conclusions unless Talia demonstrated clarity. Gathering her thoughts, Talia calmly approached the cluster of neighbors who had witnessed the scuffle. Softly, she asked if anyone had video proof of the incident. Several nodded in solidarity, one or two had indeed captured the meltdown on their smartphones. But as Talia tried to address the group, Karen shrieked again, "She's going to attack me." The implication stung. Karen wanted to cast Talia as the aggressor, flipping reality on its head. Talia swallowed an impulse to argue or show anger. She'd known from training in conflict resolution that emotional outbursts often only complicated matters further. Instead, she asked a bystander for a pool float or something to ensure Karen couldn't lunge again if she decided to lash out a second time. In a moment of improvisation, Talia ended up securing Karen's arms with a colorful pool noodle and a makeshift zip tie. It might have appeared comical under less serious circumstances, but Talia's single goal was to prevent Karen from flailing uncontrollably or causing further harm while waiting for the police. A few onlookers observed with a mix of shock and amusement as Talia, methodical yet gentle, immobilized Karen enough to keep everyone safe. Of course, Karen interpreted this as fresh aggression, unleashing a string of accusations about kidnapping and illegal restraint. Talia let the claims roll over her, focusing on ensuring the noodle's padding meant Karen wouldn't be hurt. The bizarre sight of a shrieking woman pinned by a pool toy was enough to freeze the entire courtyard. Yet Talia clung to the knowledge that the blame-laying scenario Karen concocted would crumble as soon as cooler heads and recorded footage came into play. Shortly thereafter, the sirens grew louder, culminating in a police cruiser screeching to a halt just beyond the gated pool area. Two officers rushed in, taking in the scene, Karen, strapped by a bright, floating cylinder, and Talia standing calmly, hands in the air. Onlookers offered a babble of commentary, each trying to convey what had truly happened. Talia pointed to the phones brandished by a few witnesses, gently explaining that the meltdown was recorded from multiple angles. After initial confusion, the officers approached, instructing Talia to step back. Once assured that there was no ongoing fight, they observed Karen's tearful pleas about being assaulted. Talia answered their questions with unwavering calm, describing how Karen had made the first move and how Talia's takedown had been purely defensive, nothing more than what she learned in a self-defense course. The zip ties, albeit unusual, were an impromptu measure to keep Karen from injuring herself or Talia before police arrived. While the questioning continued, neighbors approached the officers with phone videos, illustrating the exact moment Karen lunged. The visuals plainly contradicted her story, undermining her frantic claims that Talia had simply ambushed her unprovoked. Karen's earlier 911 call, which had described Talia as suspicious, also lost credibility once the timeline was compared with the actual footage. A wave of relief washed over Talia as the officers nodded, acknowledging that the evidence told a very different story from Karen's. The final step was removing the pool noodle contraption, an act done carefully so the officers could maintain control if Karen attempted to lash out again. Freed from the improvised restraint, Karen continued to rant, but it fell on unsympathetic ears. The officers, having seen the video, provided a crisp summary. She'd appeared to have escalated an unfounded complaint into a physical altercation, filing a false report in the process. For Talia, that spelled some measure of vindication. Yet she also felt the mental exhaustion of the entire fiasco. She'd come to enjoy a lazy afternoon in her residential complex, only to end up physically defending herself and dealing with the shock of an unwarranted 911 call. As the officers guided Karen away, Talia quietly reflected on how a situation could unravel so quickly when fueled by paranoia, prejudice, or a delusional sense of entitlement. The promise of a relaxed day by the pool was lost, replaced by a harsh lesson on how swiftly tension could flare in the presence of a single, unyielding personality. One moment, Camila Reed was pinned under the scorching midday sun, sipping chilled lemonade by the community pool at Valley View Estates. The next, she found herself in an unforeseen showdown with Karen, the self-appointed HOA watchdog. Karen, whose menacing approach had pivoted to direct physical aggression, now lay on the concrete screaming about an assault that Camila hadn't initiated. This was the turning point. Camila recognized that merely distancing herself from Karen might no longer suffice. Alarmed by the risk of further violence, Camila made a snap decision. To prevent Karen from flailing about, she used a brightly colored pool noodle and a set of zip ties she'd found among the pool's maintenance supplies. Though comical in concept, restraining someone with an inflatable toy, the tactic aimed to ensure neither Camila nor anyone else got hurt while waiting for the authorities. She gingerly looped the noodle around Karen's midsection, effectively immobilizing her arms, all while keeping a cautious distance. Karen howled anew, alleging Camila was committing some bizarre act of hostage-taking. The tension soared as onlookers circled, uncertain whether to intervene or let Camila's impromptu measure stand. The entire scene radiated an almost surreal ambience, with the bright turquoise water and fluttering pool umbrellas contrasting sharply against Karen's frantic shrieking. In the background, one neighbor dialed the police a second time, clarifying that there was an active confrontation in progress. To Camila's relief, a few neighbors spoke up in her defense, recounting how Karen had attacked first and was now twisting the story. In this swirl of confusion, Camila felt her pulse hammering in her ears. She'd never imagined a lazy weekend lounge session could metamorphose into a spectacle reminiscent of a tabloid drama. Yet, armed with the knowledge that multiple phone cameras were rolling, and that any official security footage would likely corroborate her side, she clung to her composure. She reminded herself that, as bizarre as it all seemed, the truth could be laid bare once law enforcement arrived. And arrive they did. Within minutes, two patrol cars pulled up, officers stepping out and striding across the pool deck. The sight that greeted them was undoubtedly unusual. Camila in her swimsuit, wide-eyed but calm, standing over Karen, who was half-tangled in a neon noodle and shrieking at the top of her lungs about unlawful restraint. Before the officers could even address them, Karen's accusations poured out, painting Camila as a vicious instigator who had pinned her down without cause. However, as the officers surveyed the scene, neighbors began offering their accounts, each story chipping away at Karen's narrative. Some brandished phone recordings where it was evident that Karen lunged first, only to be subdued by Camila's reflexes. The officers took in these clips, conferring quietly. The mention of a secure feed from the complex's camera system further solidified the sense that an indisputable record existed. Moments later, one officer kindly asked Camila to loosen the improvised restraint. She complied, unraveling the noodle and stepping back. Freed, Karen attempted to bolt upright, spewing claims about her rights and how she was the real victim. But the officers maintained professional composure, explaining that they needed to gather statements from both sides. Karen continued to spin wild versions of how she'd been singled out, referencing the inept HOA that allowed suspicious people to roam free. Yet each time she described the altercation, neighbors corrected her with eyewitness testimony that matched Camila's account. In the calm that followed, Camila recounted the entire sequence, how Karen arrived with accusations, demanded she leave her pool, and then physically lunged. She explained the rationale behind using a pool noodle to prevent Karen from doing more damage, unusual but non-violent. She even pointed out the location of the nearest camera that captured most of the confrontation. The officers nodded, taking notes. The puzzle pieces formed a consistent picture that left Karen's version in tatters. Eventually, an officer addressed Karen with a measured yet firm tone. "We've got ample evidence suggesting you initiated the fight. And the phone calls you made to 911 earlier appear to contradict the reality on site." Karen, who had banked on painting Camila as the assailant, stumbled over her protests. She demanded to see higher management or have the HOA intervene on her behalf, as though that might override the rising pile of evidence pointing to her misconduct. Camila stood by quietly, letting the facts do the talking. The relief was palpable. After all the tension, her calm had prevailed. The officers, abiding by standard procedures, conferred with dispatch and confirmed they'd already received conflicting reports from Karen. This only reinforced the notion that she had used 911 as a personal intimidation tool. By the time the conversation ended, the decision was clear. Karen faced citations for filing a false report, harassment, and possibly more if the local DA chose to pursue. In that concluding hush, a wave of hushed conversation swept through the watchers. Some parted ways, returning to sun chairs or quietly packing up their belongings, still shaken by witnessing such turmoil at a place meant for relaxation. Karen, on the other hand, left in the custody of uniformed officers, her outraged voice carrying across the water. Camila, exhaling slowly, recognized that while the immediate threat had been contained, the ramifications might linger. She glanced at the battered remains of her tranquil afternoon, feeling an odd mixture of satisfaction and sadness, satisfaction that justice had stepped in, sadness that it took such a fiasco to reaffirm what should have been obvious, that a single malicious individual can't override another's right to a peaceful, law-abiding existence. The crowd around Evergreen Muse's communal pool had grown larger by the time the police arrived to address the lingering chaos. Fatima Leonard, still reeling from the unexpected confrontation, found herself the focus of uneasy stares and hushed whispers. She glanced at the poolside clock, just a few minutes past 8:07 p.m., wondering how a simple evening of relaxation could spiral into such upheaval. Yet, there she stood, overshadowed by Karen's theatrics and the aftermath of a physical scuffle. Several residents had recorded parts of the altercation on their phones, capturing how Karen repeatedly harassed Fatima and made outlandish claims about her right to be at the pool. More damning footage included the moment Karen lunged, only to be thwarted by Fatima's calm defensive move. Now, as the uniformed officer surveyed the scene, those videos quickly dispelled any notion that Fatima was the aggressor. Karen's repeated declarations that she was terrified and attacked out of nowhere rang hollow against the clear evidence showing the opposite. The lead officer, a patient-looking woman with a notepad in hand, requested to see the recordings. Neighbors eagerly obliged, passing phones so she and her partner could watch brief clips. The officers exchanged telling glances as they observed Karen's hostile approach and false portrayal of events. With each new angle, the claim that Fatima had unlawfully occupied the pool or initiated a fight lost any shred of credibility. This was no trespasser, and certainly no aggressor, only a resident singled out by Karen's obsessive brand of gatekeeping. When Karen realized the officers weren't buying her story, she changed tactics, layering her account with dramatic accusations. She was threatening me with her eyes. I felt unsafe. But the footage thoroughly contradicted such claims, revealing Fatima had been reading quietly and had only stood up once Karen advanced. The officer eventually silenced Karen's ongoing tirade, explaining they had enough evidence to issue a citation. Karen blinked, incredulous, as she was formally informed it would be for filing a false report and harassment, serious matters, not mere slaps on the wrist. Amid this public reckoning, onlookers remained riveted. A few softly murmured their approval, relieved to see that the police recognized Karen's pattern of false accusations. Fatima, for her part, felt a wave of vindication. Although the entire scenario was far from the calm respite she'd intended, at least the truth was surfacing, validated by official eyes. She answered the officer's questions with measured clarity, confirming she was indeed a resident in good standing at Evergreen Mews and had done nothing more than lounge by the pool with a book. By the time the officers wrapped up their on-site investigation, the tension had noticeably eased. Karen, though still muttering complaints, seemed cornered by the weight of the evidence. People began dispersing, a subdued hush settling over the once bustling deck. As Fatima quietly gathered her belongings, she exhaled a mixed sigh of relief and lingering frustration. The police had confirmed her innocence, and Karen now faced official consequences. Still, Fatima couldn't shake the realization that in a single evening, her trust in the tranquility of Evergreen Mews had been deeply shaken, and all because one individual refused to respect her right to enjoy a simple evening poolside. In the days that followed the police issuing Karen a citation for harassment and filing a false report, Evergreen Mews found itself undergoing a subtle transformation. Whispers about Karen's behavior circulated among residents, some incredulous that she had escalated a routine pool visit into a full-blown confrontation. Rumors spread that the HOA, which had previously tolerated Karen's complaints for the sake of community standards, was now re-evaluating its stance, appalled at how far she'd gone. For Fatima Leonard, the immediate aftermath brought an unexpected visit from the apartment complex's management team. They offered an apology for what she'd endured, explaining that Karen had repeatedly stepped outside the bounds of rational community oversight. To show appreciation for Fatima's calm demeanor, the staff handed her a gift certificate for a local spa. Initially, Fatima hesitated, uncertain whether to accept an apology that, while sincere, couldn't erase the stress she'd experienced. Yet, she recognized the gesture as a good-faith effort to restore her sense of comfort in the place she called home. At the same time, news reached Fatima that Karen was being served eviction papers. The property manager cited repeated violations, from unauthorized surveillance attempts to harassing fellow residents. The final straw, apparently, was her confrontation with Fatima and the subsequent involvement of law enforcement. For many neighbors, this eviction came as no surprise. Karen's pattern of manufacturing drama had been an ongoing problem, overshadowing the peaceful environment that most sought at Evergreen Mews. Reactions varied across the community. Some residents felt relief, praising the management for finally taking a stand. Others worried about how Karen might react in her final days on the property, given her tendency to lash out when cornered. A few expressed sympathy despite her actions, reasoning that eviction was a harsh penalty and hoping she'd find a way to reevaluate her behavior. However, few doubted that removing her presence would help the complex return to a sense of normalcy. Amid these ripples, Fatima tried to reconcile the whirlwind of events with her previously serene perception of Evergreen Mews. She found it strange to step onto the pool deck again, half expecting another confrontation, only to discover the space truly tranquil at last. Neighbors who recognized her from the incident occasionally offered supportive nods or quietly thanked her for standing up to what they saw as an ongoing injustice. Some joked that her calm approach under pressure served as a sort of public service, reminding everyone that panic and aggression rarely solve neighborly disputes. All the while, the memory of Karen's meltdown lingered in the complex's collective consciousness, a reminder that even a shared amenity like a pool could become a flashpoint if someone weaponized petty grievances. Yet with Karen's departure looming, the tension gradually abated. Fatima accepted the gift certificate management provided, promising to treat herself to a day of relaxation, something she sorely needed after the unsettling ordeal. While the entire affair left her with lingering unease, the knowledge that justice had been served, and that a measure of peace was restored, gave her renewed faith in the community she still wished to call home. Though Karen's eviction process took a few formal steps to complete, her departure from Evergreen Mews finally arrived with little fanfare. The day she moved out, a heavy hush enveloped the courtyard, as if the complex itself exhaled relief. Boxes were hauled into a moving van by a couple of hired hands, while Karen, now subdued, oversaw the process. Gone was the strident demeanor that had once roused the entire community into conflict. For Fatima Leonard, witnessing Karen's exit was both a conclusion and an odd anticlimax. The final chapter in a saga that began with suspicious glances by the pool had ended not in further confrontation, but in a quiet retreat by the person who'd sparked so much tension. Fatima found herself reflecting on how swiftly a neighborly environment could sour when someone decided to transform community guidelines into personal vendettas. The previous weeks had tested her resolve, pushing her to stand firm in the face of false accusations and physical aggression. In a final gesture of reconciliation, the HOA approached Fatima to apologize on behalf of its oversight lapses. They admitted that they had been slow to act on earlier complaints about Karen's meddling. In response, they pledged to review their processes to prevent a single resident from wielding excessive influence again. It struck Fatima as a constructive step forward. A sign that the fiasco might actually lead to a healthier sense of neighborhood governance. Meanwhile, the apartment management reiterated their apology with sincerity, ensuring Fatima that such an incident wouldn't be tolerated in the future. The gift certificate they provided remained a symbol of that promise. A slight blush of embarrassment still colored her cheeks at the memory of how the entire fiasco drew so many watchful eyes, local media, social chatter, even extended friends. Yet in that swirl, the unwavering truth was that her calm, factual approach had proven more potent than Karen's loud claims. As the moving van pulled away, a subdued stillness returned to the courtyard. A few neighbors watched from their balconies, nodding solemnly, perhaps relieved that the era of intrusive Karenism was over. Fatima breathed a measured sigh, recalling how she'd moved to Evergreen Mews specifically for its sense of serenity. Now, it seemed that peace was restored, albeit after a storm she'd never anticipated. She silently wished Karen no ill, hoping the ordeal might prompt some self-reflection. Life went on, the pool once again filled with the hum of carefree chatter, the communal barbecue area bustled on weekends without fear of unwarranted citations, and the late evening hush signaled a return to normalcy. Glancing over her yard decorations, those that had once attracted a scornful gaze from Karen, Fatima allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The harassment was over, replaced by a quiet surety that justice and composure had prevailed. In the privacy of her lounge chair that evening, she finally read through the last chapters of her abandoned novel, a small victory, symbolizing the broader one she'd won in preserving her rightful place in the community. The memory of confrontation still flickered, but it no longer defined her days. Instead, Evergreen Mews promised a renewed sense of harmony, one that Fatima believed was all the sweeter for having been tested and, ultimately, affirmed.